Hello, and this is the demo on how to stretch canvas with stretcher bars. So basic supplies, you need a staple gun, and I prefer the T50 size staple gun with T50 size staples. Usually 3/8 inch or 5/16 inch would be good. I'm using a powered staple gun. You want a pair of scissors. You also want canvas pliers for stretching. Some type of brush so that when you apply gesso after you stretch the canvas, you want to have a brush and a water container because we want to start off with a more watered down version of gesso. Of course, you need stretcher bars, and here we have medium or heavy duty stretcher bars that are 1 1/4 inch in width. Of course, you need canvas, and some other things you might want to have are sandpaper. I like to use sandpaper on a sanding block. This is a measurement that I've for the size of canvas that you're going to need, which will come into play. You'll see in a moment. A T-square helps to make sure that all your angles are at 90-degree angles, and a hammer and or a rubber mallet will come in handy. But you don't have to have necessarily any of these things in order to stretch your canvas. But you definitely need canvas, stretchers, your gesso, some brushes to apply the gesso. These definitely help, and scissors are pretty necessary, and of course a staple gun with your staples. So for convenience sake, I'm using only 12-inch stretcher bars, but what's great about stretching your own canvas is that you can choose any dimensions that you want, and they come in all different sizes. Of course, first we need to assemble stretchers. So flat side down, and as you can see here, you can just literally by hand fit them together. In most cases, like this. As you see, they have a certain type of joint, which you can kind of fit together. And this is where a mallet or hammer might come in handy. So in this case, I can use a hammer to bring the joints together. And I want to do it evenly on each side. Sometimes if you're using a hard hammer, you're going to create some indentations along here, or you might end up breaking the joints a little bit. So that's why I like to use a rubber mallet in this case. But even if you don't have a hammer, you can take this to the ground or just a hard table like this and literally slam them together. So as you can see right now, it's not at right angles, but usually the joints are cut at an angle so that once they come together, they're pretty much at 90 degrees. Okay, once you have this all assembled, you just want to make sure that your joints are nice and tight, right? There are not too many gaps. One way to check it is if you flip it over, you can always use a T-square and check if it's at 90 degrees. Now, not everybody has a T-square, so you can use anything that has pretty much 90 degrees. So I can use my sketchbook here and just kind of check if it's lined up at 90 degrees each corner. Usually if you have two opposing corners at 90 degrees, that would mean that the other 90 degrees are going to be there as well. So this is pretty level. So what you have is a nice square. Okay. Next we'll talk about sizing the canvas. Now I just happen to have a piece that's small enough that I don't need to cut off a piece from a larger piece. And here, this is where this little kind of unit, little device helps me measure how much canvas I want away from the stretcher bars, because obviously what you need to do is you need to have enough to stretch over the edge onto the back here, which you're going to staple down. So this is actually 3 inches. So I'm able to measure from here, the edge of the canvas, to the stretcher bars. And it just so happens that it's pretty much 3 inches on these sides. So I just happen to have a good piece of canvas that doesn't have to go to waste. It will fit something like small like this. Obviously on this farther edge, over here, I do need to cut it. Right, so what I'm going to do is just kind of size it. Right. And then all I need is a small incision. I'm not sure if you can see this, but let me move this over. All you need is a small incision around the 3-inch mark. So I've already made a small incision. Now, because the canvas is woven just like any traditional fabric, you can actually tear it instead of having to cut it all the way across. And that way you know you're also tearing it at a right angle. Because like any fabric, it's woven, you know, you have a weave and a weft. So that way you know that you're getting a perfect straight edge along here for the most part. And as you can see, this is actually the cotton strands that are what the canvas is comprised of. Now right now we have some wrinkles in that, right, because this was folded and stored. But as we stretch it, we'll be able to resolve some of these wrinkles and folds in it. And then even if they are still apparent, that's why we're going to use eventually a very watered down version of gesso for our first layer, because when you apply something watery to the fiber, it's going to relax a little bit, and then as it dries, it'll even itself out. So we'll check in just a moment with the stapling process. I forgot to mention that you don't have to have something like this. I mean, you obviously can make something like this and just make sure that it's at 3 inches width, because that's pretty much the minimum that you need to kind of measure out the right size of canvas in relation to the stretcher bars. Right, so if you think about it, it's this is 12 inches by 12 inches stretcher bars, so you need 3 inches on each side, so that's adding 6 inches, right? So so you need 18 inches by 18 inches of canvas at a minimum to be able to stretch it over here. But this is just some corrugated plastic that I just cut. But obviously you can use a tape measure or a ruler and just measure out 3 inches on each side, right? But when it comes to buying canvas, you're usually gonna buy it in larger pieces that you're gonna cut down for your customizable rectangles or squares. So first, with my staple gun loaded, you want to start off with as centered as possible, right? An even amount of canvas on each side. But you got to remember, you're going to actually stretch it. So if I staple it here, maybe I want a little bit more of that. And even though it comes up a little short on this side, remember, I'm going to stretch it with these pliers to get a little bit more on this side. So you want to start with maybe a slightly uneven. And in this case, just because I'm just at a minimum, I'm going to pull this in close, right? So I'm almost at the inside edge of the stretcher bar, and I'm just going to go with one staple in the center to begin with, right? So as you can see, it's just one in the center, and then we're going to work our way to the edges. So in terms of stretching it, these are really handy because you've got this edge, which you can also use as a hammer, right? If you want to, you'll see later we're going to want to hammer these staples in a little deeper. But right now, it's not going all the way in. It's a little raised. So if I wanted to take it out to readjust, I can always do that easily with a screwdriver or something like that. So here, this hammer head also acts as a fulcrum, a lever, to get on the inside edge, and therefore I'm able to really pull this canvas in and stretch it over the bars. If you notice, I'm just about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inches in from the outer edge. I don't know if you can see that here, but here, right, this is a 1 1/4 inches depth, and I'm coming in just about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch. But another way to think about it is that I'm coming in halfway, just about halfway between the outer and the inside edge. So maybe a little closer to the outside edge, but as long as you have enough canvas, it's fine to you know, go right in the middle between the outer and inside edge. So right now I'm just trying to establish a balanced stretch. So this end I can stretch by hand, because I'm going to use the pliers on the other end to get a nice nice tension. So here we go again, and come into each edge, and here I want to use the pliers, because you want a certain amount of tension, because your painting will sag over time a little bit, and that's something else that can be addressed. That sent 2 in at the same time, but that's okay. So you know, your painting will sag a little bit over time. As you can see, the creases from the folds are starting to disappear just because of the tension. But as your painting might sag, these little notches in here, right in here, inside each corner, you can use what are called keys to literally stretch the bars apart a little bit more. Right, but that's not something I usually have to do anyway, even with bigger paintings, because in bigger paintings you're going to use crossbars as well to stabilize it. So there's your start. One at the center of each bar to just get you started for a nice even stretch, and then you're going to continue on. So I'm going to continue to use my pliers here to keep the tension good, and you want to space these about 1 inch apart, right? And what I'm doing is going 1 on each side of the center staple, and I'm going to go to the opposite edge to just make sure, because what happens sometimes is if you go from one edge to the adjacent edge, then your canvas is going to start to shift a little bit. So to keep it even and squared in relation to the stretchers, I go from opposite edges. So again, just about 1 inch apart. I do 1 on each side of the center. And you know, I don't know if you can see, but this staple here didn't go in quite straight on. So I might either pull that out and re-staple it, or I can just hammer that in, depending on how well it went into the wood. So before you staple the whole side together, you want to decide which side is going to flap on top of the other when it comes to the corners. So for example, I've decided that these sides are going to go over the top, right? And you want to do that equally on the opposite edge. Now in some people, in some cases, they have it going opposite corners and so on, right? It's going to flap over on the same way on all corners of a square. But I think standard, in most cases, you want to choose 2 opposite sides as to be the flap going over the other. So if you can see here, these 2 flaps on these 2 sides are going to go over what's on the other sides, right? The other edges. So in your case, in your view, the sides are going to go over the top and bottom. So once you've decided that, you want to take the side that's going to be on the bottom and you want to send staples all the way through. So in this case here, I could use pliers, but I'm just going to go by hand because it's pretty tight. It's really the center that needs to be established well. And I'm going to go pretty close to the edge. So this side, that's going to be under the fold, needs to be laying nice and flat. Now this is a case where if you feel confident that this is exactly where you want it, then you can use this flat edge here and just really send the staples home. Or, you know, because I have a bigger surface here. So now these staples are really committed, right? Now in terms of how to fold a corner, let's see if I can do this right. You want to take this flap in, try and line up the edge there, and then you're going to pull the corner over like this, right? Of course I'd want to do it tighter so I don't have these little flares here, but let's see if I can do it again from this angle. Maybe you can tell. So I want to push this in, right? Try and line up the fabric along there. Maybe pull a little bit, and then keep that tight. And then you might actually want to use your stretch bars and tighten up along there, right? And then my staple gun, just gonna pop it right there close to the edge, and then I can put in the remaining staples. So if you notice, the edge where I sent the staples all the way to the end, I did not do so here because I need to create that fold, right? So if you notice, what's on the bottom of your screen is on top of what's on the sides. So I want to do a similar fold where I'm going to press in, right, to keep it close to that corner edge. For the most part, try and line up the edge of the canvas. Keep this fold inside and tight, and then just fold over like that. Now this definitely takes some trial and error. Sometimes you might want to bring this a little more inside than parallel to get a tight fold. So this takes a good bit of practice. And as you can see, I didn't staple it all the way to the edge, but I'll start at the edge in this case. And I have a slight wrinkle there, that's okay. It'll work itself out later. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this edge. Press in right at the corner. Try and line up fabric here. Fold over. Sometimes if it's a little raised, as you can see here, right, I'm going to just staple right over both pieces of fabric to fold it over part as well. So I'm using the this hammered head part of it, but you can even use just the side of it. So you can pretty much do everything you need to do with these pliers. I mean, you can even use this beveled edge to hammer down. So I'm just sending these staples home. So for the most part, I'm committed, and also just to keep these edges tight, because you don't want them peeking out back here, right, from behind the painting. So you might just want to keep it inside the edge. and pop a staple like so, right? Just to keep that from peeking out. Now I didn't take the most care with folding these edges, but oh, I'm out of staples. But you know, for the sake of the demonstration, you don't necessarily want this edge peeking out. You can pull it nice and tight when you're using pliers and you have a little more time. But I'm just for the sake of the demo, I wanted to show you how to do it pretty quickly. But you know, also the farther apart these corners are, the less apparent this kind of you know, peeking out corners are going to be. Usually, if you're going to go with a rectangle, I would usually put these on the longer side. So if this was a canvas like going out to here, I'd usually fold it so that these corners are on the far ends, because on a longer piece, they're not as noticeable. I just realized that I didn't talk about why you even have sandpaper. So why would you have sandpaper? Sometimes these edges, the beveled edge that's going to be on the inside, so the fabric is actually going to, you know, be suspended from one edge to the other, right? So this is the inside. Sometimes they're a little sharp, right? So a little bit of sandpaper helps, and even the back edge sometimes. These happen to be pretty good, pretty well constructed stretchers, so they're already slightly rounded along here, so they're not too tight. But what you don't want is you don't want an edge so tight that in the long run it's going to shear through the canvas. So it's just a little bit of sandpapering, and sometimes when you bring the corners together, you'll find the edge is going to be very tight as well. So you can just sand off the corner a little bit. But usually you want to do the sanding once it's all assembled. But that's why you would have sandpaper. I like to use a sandpaper on a rubber block so that it's nice and even. It's just a helpful device for sanding, to keep a nice even sand. So that's why you would have sandpaper. Okay, so for the most part I have this stretched, and if you can hear it, it's tight enough almost to be like a drum. Right, you can literally hear and feel the tension. Right, I can press in still, right, but not so that it's you know, I indent it and it stays that way. Of course, in the long run, you don't want to be pressing on the surface of your canvas, but just the touch and sound test will tell you whether there's tension. Now, if you can see in the light, there's still the creases from the fold, but we're going to resolve that in the gesso process. So I'll check back in just a second. I'm going to get some water in my container. I'll show you how much gesso you want to put in there for starters. Okay, so as you can see, I've already opened my gesso, and I have a little bit of water here in this water container. And I'm just going to take a little bit of gesso, just so that, you know, just maybe a spoonful, a teaspoonful. And I'm just going to drop it in the water, maybe 2 teaspoons full or 1 tablespoon. Just enough to get the water to be a little opaque. Now you can actually start off with just water to resolve the kind of creases from the folds of the canvas. But as you can see, now it's not transparent water, but just a little cloudy but very watery mix. Right, so this is just kind of initial. In the long run, you'll probably do this and maybe 2 other layers. Now I have 2 different types of brushes. I have a sponge brush and a standard house painting brush, but they're both nice and wide, so that way I can cover the surface rather quickly. This obviously will hold a lot more, but in this case, since it's a watery mix, I'm just going to go with the spongy brush. But you know, your canvases, most people want to paint a little bit bigger than a 1x1, and I think in your case, you are going to be painting larger than 1x1, because I said that the minimum dimensions should be 2 by 2. So it's going to be at least 2 by 2, if not larger. I think some of you have already painted larger than that. Okay, so I haven't mixed this that evenly, but that's not a huge deal. As you can see, it's a little splotchy, but I'm just going to get over the whole surface and let the canvas absorb this. I've laid down a little newsprint so I can not worry about marking up my table. And you don't necessarily have to go in any certain direction. I just think that if you go in both directions of the weave and the weave of the canvas, the weave and the weft, or the warp and the weave, you have a better chance of saturating it. So I'm going to start with the surface, so it's nice and watery, and as this dries, whatever remaining folds that I had in the canvas should disappear. So I'm going to get a complete layer on the top, and I'm also going to do the sides. Now, some people have a different aesthetic about sides, where they'll tape it off so that no painting will ever end up on the sides. With my kind of painting, I actually think it's important to let people see how the paint comes over the side, but that's because I use a process where you pour paint and seeing how it bleeds over the edge, I think is a nice aesthetic. But some people want a nice clean edge, so you literally can tape that off so there's no running paint. And then some people also like to frame paintings. A lot of paintings, if you go to museums, most of them are going to have frames around them, so you won't even see the edge. But just to also protect the edge, I'm going to gesso the edges. So that is all 4 edges, and you can literally tell whether there's some canvas that you didn't get. You can tell the dry spots from the saturated and wet spots. So I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and wherever you still see like a crease, you want to just add a little bit more of the watery mix, because I don't know if you can tell, it's very subtle, but I want that to go away. Okay, so we'll check back in after this dries, and we'll come in with another layer. Now, if you're ever dying to get this dried faster, sooner than later, you can always use a hair dryer or a fan, and that'll definitely dry it up faster. You know, I often like to work on more than one painting at a time. So sometimes you can just set up, if you have a nice block of time, you can actually assemble multiple stretchers and then gesso them all at the same time, and then you'll have you know, prepared canvas at the ready, and that's why, you know, sometimes you might want to use a hair dryer to speed up the drying process. But I think this is pretty dry now, and for the most part I don't really see any creases. Now sometimes if you didn't stretch it tight enough, you might have creases from the folds, but in this case I think it did a pretty good job. And since I can't actually fit my brush into the gesso jar here, I'm just gonna glob it on to the canvas for my first full layer. Right, so I'm just gonna spread it around a little bit. So I think that's enough where my brush now can take over. I'm going to continue using the sponge brush, but of course you can use any brush. But I just like how even it is. I'm going to show you about how to, you know, another reason you're going to use sandpaper is if you want a super smooth edge, you want to put on a good 2 layers and then sand it down. But one of the things I think I've mentioned before is you want to try and get away from what I call the tyranny of the texture of the canvas, right? You want the texture to be determined completely by your application of paint, right? And this is, you know, kind of a sign of a mature painter, is that they are dictating every aspect of the painting, including the texture. So here you can see I've added even more gesso, and I'm not pressing down as much. I'm just like trying to get a nice thick layer over the whole surface. And it has a certain leveling out quality, but you can still see that there's a texture of the stroke in there, and that's why I'm just kind of going back and forth. And as it starts to thicken, right, you can see it starts clumping a little bit. So you want to do this pretty quickly, especially if you're trying to go for a slick surface. But as you can see now, it's covered in its nice white ground. So, you know, why is it white? Why is gesso white? Because, you know, you want to think about the quality of light going onto the surface of your painting. If you're trying to create vibrant color, you need light to pass through the color of your paint onto the white and to bounce back. So it's creating a reflective quality. Traditionally, or, you know, in the days of old, instead of using gesso, which is basically acrylic based, a chalky acrylic based ground, rabbit skin glue was what was used in the past. So that's, you know, pretty self-explanatory as to what that is, but it would be melted down and then applied to create the ground. Sometimes that was just transparent. Other times a white was added to it, and the traditional white paint was lead white, but I'm sure you know that lead is toxic, and therefore for health reasons most people transition to titanium white. So even in the corners here of the fold, I want to fill that up with gesso. So while I was waiting for this to dry, I've been editing the video together and realized that it's getting pretty long. So I'm not going to apply the second layer and wait for that to happen, because I want to get this video to you as soon as possible, because I know it's already a little delayed. So if I were to add a second layer to this, I'll wait for that to dry, of course, and then that's when I would come back with sandpaper if I wanted a very slick surface. Now, you might not want or need a super slick surface, but if you wanted one, you could just sand it down, right? Which I'm not going to do because the gesso is not totally dry. But you can sand it down until you have a very smooth surface. Now, if you were really committed to having a nice and smooth surface, you don't actually have to stretch canvas over stretcher bars. You can literally buy a board that come with different depths, and you could just gesso the wood. Some people actually do like canvas, so they would stretch the canvas over the board to have a, you know, hard surface, and then do the same thing with the sanding process. So that's it. If you need any other additional assistance or have any questions, you can either email me or just wait to the next class.